I watched my cheating wife sneak out that night. She was dressed as if the world were hers, as if every calculated step in that jump was a parade of freedom and desire. I stood there, standing in the shadow of the hallway, watching the door close behind her with a softness that hurt more than any words. My heart was beating heavy in my chest, and I knew I couldn't let it go. I needed to see how far she would go with that lie. Every part of my being screamed for me to confront her right then and there, but something inside me held me back. I needed more. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I followed his car at a safe distance, the red lights flashing like a taunt. My stomach turned with each curve, imagining what I would find at the end of that journey. It was a party. Lights, laughter, loud music. I parked on the other side of the street and waited. And then I saw him. The man I knew only in fragments, messages deleted too quickly on her cell phone, a name she mentioned as if it didn't matter. But there he was, smiling at her, touching her with the familiarity I should have been the only one to have. They entered together, their bodies too close to be just friends. I felt my face heat up, my fingers tighten on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I had imagined many things over the past few months, suspicious messages, unexplained delays, lame excuses, but seeing her there, laughing at another man as if I had never existed, broke something inside me that I knew would never be fixed. I joined the party. Nobody saw me right away. People were too busy losing themselves in their conversations and dancing to notice the man standing in the doorway with his eyes fixed on the couple in the center of the room. I walked slowly, feeling the weight of each step. When they finally saw me, the shock on her face was so clear that, for a moment, I thought everything had stopped. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, but the panic in her eyes spoke louder than the words. What are you doing here?" My voice was firm, but each word was like glass breaking inside. The man next to her tried to intervene, but I cut him off before he could say anything. "I'm not here to argue. I just want everyone to know who you really are." The hall fell silent. She tried to grab my arm, but I recoiled as if her touch burned. And that's when I made the announcement. In a few sentences, I destroyed the world she had built in secret. I told her everything, from the hidden messages to the nights she said she spent with her friends. And as I spoke, I saw the faces around me transform: shock, curiosity, judgment. She started to cry, but there was no more room for her tears. I had spilled mine alone for too many nights. "I want a divorce," I finished, with a coldness I didn't even know I possessed. But what no one knew at that moment, what she didn't know yet, was what I had saved for that moment. I had proof. Recorded messages, photos, audio, everything documented and ready to be used against her. I wasn't just going to expose her in front of everyone. I was going to destroy any chance she had of coming out of this as a victim. As I left the party, leaving behind looks and whispers, I knew this was just the beginning. Because betrayals don't just end with broken hearts. They leave traces, scars and consequences that no one expects. And in that moment, I was determined to make sure each of them felt the weight of what they had done. What came after that night was something that would completely change the way she saw her own life. Because secrets can be hidden, but not forever. And what I had prepared was something she would never have imagined. Something that could not be ignored. Something that would make everyone question what really goes on behind closed doors. Welcome to the channel where the most painful truths about cheating come to life. Here, we do not support and never justify any form of betrayal. All the stories told are fictional, but they carry powerful lessons about how infidelity can devastate lives, destroy families, and leave deep scars. Get ready to dive into an intense and shocking narrative, full of emotions and twists. Take a deep breath. The story is about to begin. David always believed that he had found in Emma the kind of love that you only read about in books or seen in movies. They met at a young age, when they were both looking for something more in their lives. David had just opened his first law firm, determined to build a solid career and offer stability. Emma, on the other hand, worked as an interior designer, passionate about creating spaces that told stories and stirred emotions. When they saw each other for the first time, at a charity event promoted by mutual friends, there was an immediate connection, almost as if the two already knew each other from another life. David was attracted to Emma's way of transforming any place into something welcoming. She was sensitive, caring, and had a natural talent for seeing beauty where others only saw simplicity. Emma, in turn, admired the confidence that David conveyed. He was meticulous, detail-oriented, and had an ability to plan for the future that made her feel protected. They quickly became inseparable and, in less than 2 years, they were married. The ceremony was intimate, surrounded only by close friends and family, but filled with emotion and promises of a future full of achievements and companionship. Life together seemed perfect. David always made a point of surprising Emma with unexpected flowers, short weekend trips, and candlelit dinners. He liked to see her smile and did everything he could to keep that flame burning. Emma, on the other hand, was dedicated to making their home a true haven. Every detail, from the pictures on the walls to the potted plants, reflected the care she took for the home they shared. In the early years, the relationship flourished. They supported each other through everything, sharing dreams, fears, and ambitions. When David won his first high-profile court case, Emma was in the front row, giving him a standing ovation. And when Emma had her first project published in a decoration magazine, David made a point of buying dozens of copies to distribute to everyone they knew. They were, in the eyes of outsiders, the perfect couple. But, as in every story, there were invisible layers that not even they could fully see. David, with his dedication to work, began spending more time at the office. The weight of responsibilities increased, and he found himself constantly in meetings, planning, and traveling. Emma tried to understand, but as time passed, she began to feel empty. The nights when I was alone at home became more frequent, and the silence seemed to scream from every corner. Emma was never the type to complain. She always tried to keep up appearances, smiling at friends and family and reassuring them that everything was fine. But inside, she felt neglected. The love that once seemed unshakable began to feel distant, as if it were out of reach. She tried to talk to David about how she felt, but he, stuck in routine and tired, believed it was just a phase, something passing. David, on the other hand, was exhausted. He knew he spent less time with Emma than he should have, but he justified it as a necessary sacrifice to ensure a comfortable future for both of them. He believed he was doing the right thing and consoled himself with the idea that, once everything was more stable, he could make up for lost time. Even with the difficulties, there were times when they still managed to reconnect. Occasional trips, special nights, and conversations until late at night rekindled the flame that, despite the challenges, remained there. David believed these moments were proof that nothing could shake their relationship, and Emma clung to the hope that things would go back to the way they were. People around them continued to see them as a perfect couple. At social events, they always arrived together, exchanging smiles and affection that seemed genuine. David liked the image they gave, and Emma did her best to maintain that appearance, even when, inside, she felt more lost than ever. Time, however, has a cruel way of exposing cracks. Small details began to catch David's attention. Calls that Emma answered in a low voice and quickly ended, messages that she deleted before he could see them. There were moments when David felt his stomach turn, but he pushed the thoughts away, convincing himself it was just paranoia. Emma also struggled with her own demons. I felt guilty for moving away emotionally, but at the same time, I wanted something I couldn't name. She longed to feel wanted again, to have attention and to remember what it was like to be a priority in someone's life. Despite everything, David continued to trust Emma. He held on to the happy memories and the love he knew existed between them. But the discomfort grew, silently, like a shadow he couldn't shake. And then, there was that night. A night that started like any other, but ended with David standing in the doorway, watching Emma get ready with a care he hadn't seen in months. She said she would go out with her friends, but something about the way she avoided his eyes made his chest tighten. As the door closed behind her, David stood there, motionless. He felt his heart beating faster than it should and, as much as he tried to ignore it, a voice inside him whispered that something was wrong. He tried to convince himself that it was an exaggeration, but the weight in his chest wouldn't leave him alone. He grabbed his car keys and left, deciding to follow the instincts he had ignored until that moment. The path to his destination seemed longer than usual, each red traffic light adding to the anxiety that was already consuming him. When he finally parked, he saw Emma across the street, entering a bright and crowded place. David stayed in the car for a few minutes, watching from afar. He fought the urge to go in and confront her right then and there, but something stopped him. Instead, he got out of the car, took a deep breath, and crossed the street, each step feeling as if he were walking toward a cliff. Inside the hall, the music drowned out the sounds of one's own thoughts. David looked for Emma in the crowd, and when he finally found her, he felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. She was not alone. The man next to her smiled in a way that David recognized immediately. His body froze, but his mind went into a whirlwind. He needed to act, needed to say something, but everything inside him seemed stuck. Emma turned, and her eyes met his. For a second, the world seemed to stop. And in that moment, David knew that nothing would ever be the same. David stood at the door of the party, feeling the weight of everything he had been through in the last few months crashing down on him. His eyes were fixed on Emma, who was dancing in the center of the room, laughing as if the world were hers. The dress she wore seemed chosen to provoke, hugging every curve of her body in a way that David could no longer ignore. But what really made his stomach turn was the way she looked at the man beside her. There was something in the looks exchanged, in the closeness between the two, that surpassed any limit of friendship or innocence. The man touched his arm casually, but too intimately, as if he had done it many times before. Emma didn't back down. On the contrary, he leaned towards him, making it clear that there was comfort in that touch. David felt his heart race. He tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt heavy. Every laugh from her was like a blow, every smile shared between the two made something inside him break. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm himself, but when he opened them again, he saw the man's hand slide down Emma's back, pulling her closer. She allowed it, and in that instant, something inside David changed. He no longer had any doubts. The questions he had been avoiding for weeks finally had answers, and they were answers he didn't want to hear. He walked through the room with firm steps, but the noise of the music drowned out the sound of his own feet. He stopped a few meters away from her, and it was only then that Emma saw him. Her eyes widened, and for a brief moment, David noticed the panic taking over her. She tried to hide it, smiling in a way that looked more like a silent apology, but it was too late. David had seen enough. The man beside her turned to face him, confused by the unexpected presence. Emma took a step forward, as if to intercept David before he could say anything, but he raised his hand, stopping her from continuing. The silence that formed around them was almost deafening. Some people stopped dancing and began to watch, attracted by the tension in the air. David felt the heat rising to his face, but his voice was firm, even though inside he was crumbling. He asked who that man was, but the answer came in the form of hesitation. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was the lover who tried to break the silence, extending his hand to introduce himself, as if that would resolve the situation. David ignored the gesture, looking directly at Emma, hoping she would say something, anything that would ease the crushing weight of the moment. But she didn't say. The people around began to whisper, and Emma finally found her voice, saying that she could explain. David laughed, but it was an empty laugh, full of bitterness. He asked what exactly she thought needed explaining. The way she smiled at another man. The intimate touch. The deleted messages and empty apologies. She tried to grab his arm, but he pulled away, as if her touch were poisonous. David felt his eyes burning, but he wouldn't let tears appear there, in front of everyone. He turned to leave, but Emma followed him, calling his name. He stopped before reaching the door, feeling everyone's eyes fixed on him. He turned slowly, looking her in the eyes, and asked how long this had been happening. She stammered, saying it meant nothing, that it had been a mistake, but her every word was like a knife being driven a little deeper. He shook his head, laughing again, but this time without any sound. He said there was nothing more to be said there. As he left, he heard Emma crying, but he didn't stop. He crossed the room, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on his back, and went out into the parking lot, where the cold night air seemed to cut into his skin. He leaned against the car, trying to breathe, but everything seemed to spin around him. David stood there for a few minutes, feeling his anger growing. She thought about going back, about confronting her lover, about exposing them even more, but she knew that wouldn't change anything. He looked at the phone, thinking about calling someone, but who would he call? Who could understand what he was feeling? He was alone in that pain. When Emma left the party, she found him still standing by the car. She was crying, saying she could explain, that she didn't want to lose him. David crossed his arms, waiting, but her every word sounded like an apology. He asked if she had even thought about him while she was doing that, if she had remembered the promises they made to each other. She tried to tell him that she still loved him, but he couldn't believe it. He asked how she could betray everything they had built. Emma begged him not to do anything impulsive, but David felt his blood boil. He said he had done enough for the night, but that it wouldn't end there. He got into the car and left without looking back, leaving her standing in the parking lot, lost between crying and silence. As he drove, Davi felt the weight of what had just happened. The image of Emma with another man was burned into his mind, replaying like a movie he couldn't escape. He thought about all the times he ignored the signs, how he tried to justify the delays, the averted looks, the poorly prepared excuses. He felt foolish for having trusted so much, for having believed that their love was strong enough to withstand anything. He stopped the car a few blocks from home, feeling unable to enter that space that now seemed contaminated by lies. He stood there, staring at the steering wheel, as he tried to understand what he was going to do next. I knew I needed to act, but the pain was still too strong to allow any clear thinking. David took out his cell phone and started looking for old messages, photos, anything that confirmed what he already knew. He found more than he expected. Messages that left no room for doubt, conversations that showed an intimacy that he would never have imagined. He felt his stomach drop, but he continued. That couldn't be ignored. He needed to face what was there, no matter how much it hurt. That night, David didn't sleep. He sat in the room, surrounded by the evidence he had collected, each one a cruel reminder of what he had lost. He knew he needed to be prepared for what came next. Because that betrayal was just the beginning. And deep down, he knew that Emma still had more secrets hidden. Secrets he was determined to discover, no matter the cost. David stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the evidence he had gathered. The messages, the audios, the photos. Every piece of paper and every recording echoed like an irreversible sentence. He held his cell phone tightly, his fingers shaking, as he listened to the recorded whispers again. Emma's voice and her lover's voice intertwined in promises he had never heard, hushed laughter that pierced his mind. His breathing was heavy, and his heart was beating too fast, as if it wanted to escape his chest. The bitter taste in the mouth was almost unbearable. He looked at the clock. There were just a few minutes left before she arrived. And this time, he would be waiting. This time, she would have no way to escape. When the door opened, Emma entered without immediately noticing his presence. She dropped her bag on the couch and took off her shoes, as if nothing had changed, as if the world was still the one David trusted her with. When she looked up and saw him standing there, staring, she froze. For a moment, just one, David saw the fear in her eyes, and it made his blood boil. She tried to smile, but the smile died before it fully formed. The silence between them seemed suffocating. Emma finally tried to break him, asking him why he was standing there like that. David didn't respond right away. Instead, he took out his cell phone and played one of the recordings. Her voice filled the room, soft at first, but cutting for him. It was a conversation that was too intimate, too personal, and the male voice on the other end made David grip his cell phone even tighter, as if he wanted to break it. Emma took a step back, stammering that it wasn't what it seemed, but David didn't let her continue. He asked how she had the courage to lie for so long, how she could look him in the eye every day knowing what she was doing. Emma began to cry, begging him to let her explain, but her every word seemed just an empty echo. David was tired of excuses, tired of lies. She tried to get closer, but he backed away, asking how long it had been going on. She hesitated, and that was enough for him to know that the truth would be even worse than he imagined. He pressed her, demanding answers, and finally Emma gave in, confessing through tears that the affair had started months before. But David was not prepared for what came next. He asked why. Why had she done that after everything they had built together? Emma looked at him with teary eyes and said that she didn't know, that she felt alone, neglected, but that it should never have happened. David felt his chest tighten, anger mixing with pain. He couldn't believe that, after everything, he still wanted to understand. He still wanted to find a justification that would alleviate her guilt, but there weren't enough justifications in the world for what she had done. It was then that Emma did something unexpected. She stood up, wiping away her tears, and asked how he had gotten the recordings. She asked if he had followed her, if he had hacked into her phone. David laughed, but it was a humorless laugh. He said she wasn't in a position to demand anything, but Emma insisted, asking if he had planned it. It was at that moment that he realized there was no going back. David pulled a folder of documents off the table and threw it in front of her. He said he had hired a private investigator as soon as the suspicions began. He said he had recordings, photos, messages and even videos. Every detail of her case was there, organized and ready to be used. Emma went pale, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. He asked what he intended to do with it, but David didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, he said he wanted her to understand the weight of the choices she made. She said that not only did the betrayal destroy him, but also the trust he had in her, in the life they had built. Emma tried to defend herself, saying that it didn't define who she was, that she still loved him, but David interrupted her. He asked if she really believed that love and betrayal could coexist. She was silent. David stood up, pacing the room like a caged animal. He said that not only had he discovered the betrayal, but that he had prepared himself to ensure that she did not go unpunished. Emma looked at him, confused, until he revealed what he had done. He said he had already started the divorce process. He said that the lawyers already had all the necessary documentation to prove her infidelity and ensure that he got out of that situation with the greatest possible advantage. Emma was in shock. He asked how he could be so cold, how he could just destroy everything like that. David laughed again, asking how she could have done the same thing and expected a different result. He said he wouldn't be the one to lose everything. She begged, saying that she didn't want to lose the life they had, that she was sorry, but David didn't believe her. She said that regret didn't change anything, it didn't erase what she had done. She tried to get closer again, but David raised his hand, stopping her. He said he no longer trusted her, that he couldn't continue living a lie. Emma fell to her knees, crying, but David remained firm. He said that this was the consequence of her choices and that, for the first time in a long time, he was in control. Emma asked what would happen to her, how she could move on after everything. David responded that that was a question she should have asked before destroying the marriage. He said that, from that moment on, everything she valued was hanging in the balance, and that he would have no mercy. As she cried, David took the folder of documents and left, leaving her alone in the middle of the room, surrounded by the wreckage of the life they had built together. But as he walked outside, he felt something different. A feeling I didn't expect. He felt no relief. I felt empty. Because, despite everything, part of him still loved Emma. And that, more than anything else, was what hurt the most. But David knew there was more. I knew that night was not the end, but just the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would change their lives forever. David left the house without looking back, but as soon as he closed the door, he felt the weight of silence spread through the hallway. The folder of documents was still in his hands, as if that pile of evidence carried the full weight of the betrayal he had just confronted. He crossed the street and got into the car, throwing the briefcase on the passenger seat. He stood still for a few seconds, staring at the steering wheel, trying to absorb everything that had just happened. The muffled sound of Emma's sobs still echoed in his head, but he knew he couldn't let himself weaken. That wasn't the end. There was still more. He started the engine and drove aimlessly, passing streets he barely recognized. The city looked different that night, as if each streetlight cast longer shadows than usual. He needed to think, needed to decide what to do next. He parked near a park and stood there, watching the couples passing by, some holding hands, others laughing as if the world carried no pain. He gripped the steering wheel tightly and felt the heat rising to his face. Why him? Why had the life he had so carefully built fallen apart like this? He picked up his phone and started scrolling through messages once again. He read every word as if it were the first time, absorbing every detail, every laugh typed, every plan made between Emma and her lover. He felt his stomach drop as he read an excerpt in which they talked about a trip they were planning together, a trip that, ironically, he himself had suggested to her as a way to disconnect from stress. He threw the phone on the bench next to him and ran his hands over his face, taking a deep breath. He couldn't let that destroy him. His phone vibrated. It was Emma. He ignored the call, but a few seconds later, she called again. And once again. Finally he answered, but said nothing. The silence on the other end was almost deafening until she finally spoke. She begged him to come back, said she needed to talk, that it couldn't end like that. David laughed, but the sound was weak, almost lifeless. He asked what more she could say, what more there was to reveal. Emma was silent for a moment, but then said there was something he didn't know. Something that changed everything. David felt his heart race. He asked what it was, but she said she couldn't speak on the phone. She asked him to come home, promised that everything would make sense, that he needed to hear what she had to say before making any definitive decision. Against his better judgment, David hung up the phone, turned the car around and drove back. When he entered, he found Emma sitting on the sofa, her eyes red and her face marked by tears. She stood up, but he raised his hand, asking her to stay where she was. He said she had exactly 5 minutes to explain whatever was so important. Emma took a deep breath and began to speak. She said that her lover was not just a man with whom she had had an affair. He was a former college classmate, someone who had reappeared in her life unexpectedly. At first, it had just been a friendship, an innocent exchange of messages, but things had changed when he started asking questions about David's company, about contracts, about clients. David frowned and asked her to continue. Emma revealed that her lover was involved in a corporate espionage scheme. He had manipulated her to get confidential information about the cases David was defending. She said that, at first, she didn't realize what was happening, but when she did, she was already too involved. He threatened her, saying that if she didn't continue cooperating, he would destroy her reputation and reveal everything to David before she could explain herself. David was silent, absorbing every word. He asked her why she didn't just come to him, why she didn't ask for help. Emma lowered her head, saying she was afraid. Fear of being judged, fear of being abandoned. He said he thought he could control the situation, that he would be able to leave without leaving a trace, but everything got out of control. David felt his blood boil. He got up and started walking around the room, trying to understand how she had allowed it to get this far. He asked her if she really thought she could hide something like that forever. Emma came closer, holding his hands, but he pulled them away. He asked if she knew what that meant, what could happen to him and the company because of what she had done. Emma started crying again, saying she didn't know how to fix this, that she needed him to find a solution. But David couldn't think about anything other than the fact that the woman he loved, the woman he trusted, had destroyed everything. He asked if she had any idea of the impact this would have, not just on their lives, but on his reputation. She said that there was no more contact with her lover, that she had cut everything off, but David didn't believe her. He asked if she had proof, if she could guarantee that he wouldn't come back to threaten her or, worse, attack him directly. Emma didn't know how to respond. David picked up the document folder and threw it on the table. He said he would use all of that against her if necessary. He said he would not only file for divorce, but also file a lawsuit for moral damages. Emma fell to her knees, begging him not to do this, saying she was sorry, that she would do anything to repair the damage. But David was determined. He took the car keys and said he would go straight to the lawyer. Emma ran after him, holding onto his arm, but David let go and walked out the door. She stood at the entrance, crying, as he disappeared into the darkness. Driving through the city, David felt the weight of the decision he had just made. I knew there was no going back. He knew that even if part of him still loved her, he could never forgive her. She had destroyed everything, not just with the betrayal, but with the lies that continued even after being confronted. He stopped in front of the lawyer's building and took a deep breath. He looked at the folder on the bench next to him and felt a tightness in his chest. He knew he was about to close a chapter in his life, but he also knew he needed to do it to move forward. Because, at that moment, David no longer had any doubts. That story was far from over. And he was ready to face whatever came his way. David sat in the car, his fingers gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The weight of what had just happened seemed more than he could bear. Emma's words echoed in her head, repeating like a broken tape, and no matter how much she tried to shake them off, they continued to pierce her mind. Corporate espionage. Manipulation. Threats. He wondered how it was possible not to notice the signs, how he allowed everything to get to this point without noticing the warnings that had been there all along. But perhaps worst of all was the fact that, even now, a part of him still wanted to believe that there was something to be saved. He looked at the folder of documents on the passenger seat. The evidence was there, concrete and irrefutable, but somehow it seemed empty at that moment. As if they weren't enough to justify the devastation I felt. He took a deep breath and got out of the car, entering the lawyer's building with heavy steps. He felt as if he was carrying a weight on his shoulders that bent him with every step. He went up to the office, but as soon as he touched the handle, he stopped. His reflection in the glass door showed a different man than he had been weeks ago. Her eyes were tired, her shoulders were slumped, and the determination that had once seemed unshakable now fought against hesitation. Returning to the car, he sat down again and threw his head back, staring at the ceiling as if waiting for answers to fall from the sky. He knew he needed to move on, he knew that that relationship was irreparably broken, but the memories insisted on pulling him back. The first years together, the plans, the trips, the smiles shared on lazy Sunday mornings. Thinking about it only made the pain worse, but he couldn't stop. He picked up the phone and, without thinking much, called a longtime friend. When the voice on the other end answered, David couldn't say anything at first. He just breathed, fighting to maintain his composure. When he finally spoke, the words came out quickly and disorganized, as if he were trying to get everything out at once. He told about the betrayal, about the discoveries, about the scheme involving his company. His friend's reaction was one of shock, but also indignation. He tried to convince David to go to the police, to expose everything, but David hesitated. I didn't know if I was ready to take it to an even greater level. He hung up the call feeling even more lost. He looked at the night outside, the streets almost deserted, the lights in the houses turned off. He imagined how many other people were living lives similar to his, how many other couples were hiding secrets that, if revealed, could destroy everything. He felt a tightness in his chest as he realized that, in a way, he still cared about Emma, and that infuriated him. He should hate her, should want to see her pay for every tear she shed, but instead he could only wonder if there was anything he could have done differently. When he returned home the next morning, he found Emma sitting on the couch, her eyes swollen and red. She stood up as soon as he entered, but he raised his hand, asking her to stay where she was. She started talking, asking for another chance, saying she would do anything to prove she could change, but David didn't respond. He just watched her, trying to understand if there was any sincerity in those words or if they were just more lies to try to keep him close. She approached slowly, saying that she had looked for her ex-lover and made it clear that she wanted nothing more to do with him. He said he would hand over all the messages and recordings he had, and that he would testify against him if necessary. David interrupted her, asking why she was willing to do this now, after everything. Emma was silent for a moment before admitting that she was scared. Fear of losing everything, fear of being exposed, fear of being alone. David felt his chest tighten. I knew that wasn't love. It was despair. And as much as he wanted to believe there was something genuine in her words, he knew he couldn't trust her anymore. He said he needed time, but inside, he already knew that conversation wouldn't change anything. He had already made his decision, even if he still didn't have the courage to admit it out loud. Over the next few days, David began to organize his life. He transferred accounts, reviewed documents and held meetings with lawyers. Emma tried to get closer several times, offering help, trying to show that she was willing to rebuild trust, but he kept his distance. Her every attempt only served to remind him of how deceived he had been. But there was something that bothered him even more. The idea that Emma's lover was still around. That perhaps he was waiting for the right moment to reappear. David began checking his surroundings more frequently, paying attention to strange cars parked on the street. He knew he was being paranoid, but he couldn't help it. Until, one night, he found a letter on the windshield of his car. No signature, no sender, just a few handwritten words. You don't know everything. David felt his heart race as he read those words over and over again. He ran into the house, locked the doors and tried to imagine who could have left it. Emma swore she didn't know anything, but David no longer knew who to believe. He spent the next few hours combing through the files again, looking for anything he had missed, some clue that would explain what that message meant. When he finally found an old email, lost among the messages, his blood ran cold. It was a notice, sent by an unknown contact, warning of suspicious transactions involving the company. David realized the problem was bigger than he imagined. This wasn't just emotional betrayal or corporate espionage. There was something deeper, something that hadn't yet been fully revealed. And at that moment, he knew he couldn't continue acting alone. He needed to discover the truth, even if it meant confronting secrets he might prefer not to know. When he looked at Emma, who was sleeping on the sofa, he realized that the woman he knew no longer existed. And, perhaps, he was also no longer the same man he believed himself to be before all this began. Whatever was coming, he knew he couldn't take it back. And that was, perhaps, the scariest part of it all. David felt the weight of the last few weeks bearing down on him like an unbearable weight. The letter left in the car continued to haunt him, the words echoing in his mind like a constant warning that the nightmare was not yet over. He watched Emma from afar, analyzing her every gesture, every attempt to appear remorseful, and yet he couldn't believe a single word that came out of her mouth. The image of her with another man remained etched in his mind, but now it was overshadowed by the revelation that the betrayal went far beyond something emotional. He knew he was dealing with something darker, something that put his career, his name, and even his safety at risk. The next morning, David finally decided to go to the police. He took the documents, recordings and messages, handing over everything as evidence. The investigators seemed serious, and one of them warned that the case could drag on for months until everything was clarified. David left the police station feeling empty, as if, despite having done what was right, something was still missing. He looked at his phone waiting for a message, a call or any clue that would lead him to the person responsible for all the destruction. On the same day, Emma looked for him once again. She was desperate, begging for a chance to explain herself better, saying she had been manipulated and never wanted to hurt him. David stopped her, saying that her apology wouldn't erase what had been done. She cried as she tried to convince him that she could help fix everything, but he just shook his head. He said he no longer trusted her and that, regardless of the outcome of the investigations, their marriage was over. The following days were a whirlwind. David began to notice strange movements around his house. Cars that stopped for a few minutes and then left. People who looked too much, but looked away when he looked. He knew that Emma's lover was still nearby, perhaps watching, waiting for the right moment to act. Paranoia grew, and he began carrying important documents with him, as if he needed to always be prepared to flee or defend himself. One night, while going through the files once again, he received a call from an unknown number. When he answered, he heard a familiar voice. He was the man Emma had gotten involved with. He was calm, almost mocking, saying he knew David had gone to the police and that it was a mistake. He said that the evidence David gave was not enough to incriminate him and that he would always have a plan to escape. David felt his blood boil, but remained calm and asked what he wanted. The man replied that he wanted everything silent. He said that if David dropped the complaint and let the case die, he would disappear and leave Emma alone. David hung up without answering, but that call was the push he needed to make his final decision. The following day, he took new evidence to the police, including a recording of that conversation. He knew it would put even more pressure on the case, but he also knew he couldn't back down. He had come too far to give up now. Meanwhile, Emma was sinking deeper into her own regret. She tried every way to save the marriage, even hiring lawyers who suggested agreements to divide the assets without protracted litigation, but David refused. She lost emotional control and started avoiding leaving the house, afraid of people's judgment. Her social networks were invaded by cruel messages, and people began to treat her as someone despicable. Her lover, on the other hand, disappeared, leaving her alone to deal with the consequences. David, as much as he tried to move on, still felt anger mixed with sadness. He started to focus on work, but knew he needed something more to rebuild himself. That was when he decided to sell the house where they lived. Every room in that place held memories that he needed to leave behind. While packing his belongings, he found old photos, letters and small objects that reignited the pain. But he continued. I needed to end that cycle. Emma tried to talk to him one last time before he moved out. She appeared at the door, pale and visibly fragile. He said he knew he had lost everything, but asked him to remember what they experienced before everything fell apart. David looked her in the eyes and said that the past didn't change the present. He said he might have felt sorry for her, but he didn't feel anything anymore. She cried, but he just closed the door. Emma's lover was finally found by police weeks later, trying to flee to another country. David's evidence was enough to convict him of corporate espionage and fraud, which landed him behind bars. Emma, however, continued to sink. She lost her job and was forced to leave the lifestyle she had. Her friends abandoned her, and public shame made her withdraw from everything. David, on the other hand, began to find peace. He moved to a new apartment, simpler but comfortable. He started going out more, meeting new people, until he found someone who brought back the feeling of being valued. Someone who reminded him that true love doesn't have to be complicated or painful. Little by little, he rediscovered the meaning of trust. When he received the news that Emma had left town, he felt relief mixed with melancholy. I knew she would pay a high price for what she did, but I also knew that, at some point, I would need to forgive her to truly move on. David learned that the pain of betrayal doesn't disappear overnight, but that it can be transformed into strength. He never ignored his instincts again and became more aware of the intentions of those around him. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Leave your comments sharing your opinion. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take the opportunity to subscribe now. Here, we explore stories that show how decisions have consequences and how betrayal can change lives forever. Remember, this channel does not support cheating in any form. Until the next story.